Utilitarianism is often thought of, and thought of by quite a lot of philosophers, as an obtuse, heartless, economistic philosophy. And I used to think this, and I used to write this. But over the years, I've tried to understand the philosophical underpinnings, really, of the law and economics movement at a deeper level, and to really see the principal philosophers behind it, what's driving them, what social concerns were at the base of their formulation of utilitarianism. And I think that if we see these major exponents in their own historical context, focusing on their role as legal thinkers, and asking what motivated them to criticize the common law and to try to substitute a more objective metric of utility for the common law, I think we'll see that they were animated above all by a radical mistrust of conventional judgments and traditions, which they took to be the expressions of elite privilege in lots of different areas. So law, as they saw it, had not only been haphazard and irrational, but had been based on the self-privileging, self-insulating sentiments of a class and gender and sexual elite. And we'll get to the species elite in a bit, because that's one of the most exciting parts for me. So I came here, really, that people explicitly said they wanted to hire me as somebody who provided a principled defense of the common law by my work on Aristotle, and that could be a kind of debating partner for the law and economics movement, and I certainly did that. In my book, Poetic Justice, I represented Richard Posner as Dickens's character, Mr. Gradgrind, and we had a very spirited and fun debate. But you know, over the years, I have to say that I've shifted. In a way, I guess I haven't so much shifted as seeing my own view in a different light, seeing my own view as a progressive and critical social view as owing a great deal at bottom to the insights of the utilitarians. And so I guess now I would call myself a consequentialist and a certain kind of type of utilitarian, although much closer ultimately to Mill than to Bentham. So it's a record of what I think is greatest in our own culture, and that is that people really being open to listening to other people and open to change and rethinking. And of course, that to me is what keeps a philosopher alive. If I always were just defending my own view, I think that would not be very much fun, and it would quickly get very, very boring to others and to me also. So without further ado, so when the utilitarians came on the scene, the dominant approach to law and to ethics more generally was indeed what was embodied in common law traditionalism. Let's talk about Burke for a minute, because Burke is the one who formulates the arguments behind the common law with greatest explicitness. So there's quite a few things Burke says, but there are two arguments above all that he has for relying on the past and on the record of gradually accumulating tradition in both ethics and law. The first one is an argument from stability. And of course, his great opponent was the French Revolution. And so what Burke says is revolutionary change is often very harsh, and you throw things all up in the air and you don't know what's going to come down on the other side. Much better to think gradually and to build gradually on what's best in the past, and any decent society needs to do that. But then he has another argument, and this argument has been the primary argument today defending the common law. And I think you all should know that the best defense of the common law today is that by David Strauss. He is the most philosophically interesting and subtle thinker who now defends the common law. And I would say Ed Levy, who used to do that, Strauss has moved way beyond Ed Levy. So the other argument is an argument from experience. So let me try to put it in a rather attractive light at first before I attack it. The idea is that fidelity to past law is a good default rule, at least, because the law, especially the common law, embodies the wisdom of many minds confronting in good faith and with searching intelligence many situations of many different kinds over a long period of time. Its ideas have weathered many tests or have been revised when they didn't, and on the whole, this kind of cumulative wisdom of many minds is more trustworthy than any single mind. Legislators and judges should, on the whole, then rely on this kind of cumulative past tradition rather than making personal forays into lawmaking, and not out of sheer deference to the past as such, but with a kind of sense of their own limits. So it's a council of humility and a sense of each person's bounded rationality. Of course, this is very Aristotelian, and it was very much in that spirit that I used to propose a kind of Aristotelian defense of the common law. Now, that's, there's something in that, surely. But this argument has a glaring limitation. If many people have been excluded from this process, then the law, by definition, does not embody their insights and has not been tested for its applicability to their lives. The common law of Bentham's time did not embody the insights of the lower classes or of women, who of course didn't have suffrage yet, or of racial and religious and sexual minorities. And insofar as it embodied the thinking of sexual minorities, that is, closeted gay men, it was likely to be in the form of a hypocritical kind of doublethink, as when the British Parliament in 1895 overwhelmingly and almost, I think it was unanimous actually, passed a crippling new law that added further penalties to the existing penalties for homosexual acts. So you kind of had to get on the bandwagon or else you would be suspect. And so, yeah, it embodied their self-protected, closeted insights, but that's not a very good thing. So I'll get back to what those laws were later. But finally, the experience argument also imputes a kind of good faith to legislators that is implausible. Certainly, some legislators and some judges do want to get things right, and they do search for the best argument, and so on. But there are a lot of people who want to shore up their own class privilege and to keep down the people who threaten their power. So the experience argument has normative force only in a context where most people are really proceeding in good faith, and that doesn't seem to be a very good presumption, especially in a highly hierarchical and divided society. So, for the early British utilitarians, the common law is, first of all, a mess. Not implausibly, they think that it's just, there's no principle or method to it, and it has no clear or determinate guidance to give to judges. And so it's, first of all, simply an invitation to the judge or the legislator to do whatever they please. But they also see this irrational mess as not especially benign. They're highly skeptical of tradition, which they see as riddled with prejudice and an arbitrary privileging of some groups and people over others. So the past is not so much a source of wisdom as it is an excuse for people with power to torment other people and to keep them down. Now, instead of seeing the common law as wisdom emerging from many minds working in good faith, then all the utilitarians see it as the product of minds in bad faith bent on denying the claims of others. I won't talk much about Sidgwick. Sidgwick is very fascinatingly contorted in his wrestling with the common law, but I'm going to focus on Bentham and Mill. So what do we want in place of that? The utilitarians say we need some sort of objective, scientific, rational approach that stands outside existing privileges and the beliefs that those give rise to, and that looks at each person as equal to every other. Bentham's great maxim was, each to count for one and none for more than one. So the objective metric that he chose was pleasure, because pleasure is something we all have, and you can measure its quantity, at least he thought we could. It treats all bodies equally. It doesn't say, the pleasures of this working class body are less important than the pleasures of the aristocratic body. And so basically he says each person is typically striving to maximize personal pleasure, but the rational end of a system of law should be maximized to maximize total, or sometimes he says average, pleasure. And he thinks that it's law that supplies the coordination necessary to get to this social goal. So law should basically promote the welfare of all, using this unbiased and clear-eyed calculus in which, indeed, each counts for one and none for more than one. Law's job is constructive, forward-looking, and resolutely critical. And of course, it is very clear to the utilitarians that most people do not treat the pleasures of society's members equally, even if one confines oneself to its human members. Now I want to look at some of the areas in which Bentham and Mill made crucial critical interventions. First, the criminal law, and then gender equality, then sexual orientation, and finally, which is a big part of the book I'm writing on animals right now, the equality of species. Okay, so the criminal law, the most famous published stuff from Bentham is on the criminal law. Now, about 90% of Bentham's work was unpublished for a long time, and it's dribbling out bit by bit as the people at University College London publish it, but still quite a lot of it is unpublished. But anyway, his famous published work, Principles, Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, focused on the criminal law. And so what was the system before Bentham came on the scene? Well, the dominant picture of punishment was retributive. That law should embody a spirit of angry retributivism and often use punishments that are extremely harsh to express society's denunciation and disapproval of criminal acts and to get revenge on them. Now, the utilitarians, first of all, think that the whole idea of basing a system of law on retribution is irrational because it's an attempt to kind of fix a past crime by paying back pain for pain, and that seems to them quite an irrational thing to do. You should try to improve the future. So their basic idea in the sphere of punishment is to shift from retribution to deterrence, because we face forward and we think, well, if we're going to use punishment, how can we actually make less crime in the future? And so the idea of Bentham in the sphere of punishment is to choose the kind of punishment, the kind and degree of punishment that affects three things: specific deterrence for that offender, general deterrence for society at large, and reform. Now, of course, these things are well known to us. They're kind of like daily, daily food for everyone who works in this field. But that was totally new. Bentham brought that on the scene. And reform was a very important part of his view. I'm not sure he did especially well by that, but he certainly tried. And so along the way, he strongly attacks very commonly loved things. Number one, the death penalty, and number two, torture. So he goes several different treatises called Rationale of Punishment and On Death Punishment and so on. He talks about how, you might think that the death penalty serves the purpose of specific deterrence pretty well, but nonetheless, that's wiped out by several other problems. First of all, in the Britain of his day, the death penalty was used for all sorts of crimes of different severity. So if you, petty theft, you would get the death penalty. So he thinks, first of all, by leveling distinctions of severity, you just flunk the general deterrence test, because someone will now be perfectly willing to commit a homicide rather than a petty theft if they think the punishment's going to be the same anyway. So that was one point he made. But I'm more interested, actually, in a quite different point that he makes, which is not so often noticed, partly because this part of his work is not yet published. But it's that punishment should not be the focus of the system of criminal justice at all, because punishment only fixes crime once it's already occurred. But obviously, if you're looking forward, it's much more rational to try to prevent crime from happening in the first place. And how do you do that? Well, obviously not by punishing people, but by doing the things, and I'll put it in my own words now, that a good parent would do who was trying to bring up a child not to be a criminal, namely nutrition, education, respect, employment opportunities, and so on. And he says, by this way, he says, you'll get a better result at a cheaper rate. You won't have to torment people, but you'll actually make them less likely to commit crime. And that's the best way to deter. Now, as I say, the big book of Bentham makes that point very forcefully, but then moves on to the question, well, still, we're going to have some punishment. There'll be a remainder that will not be deterred, and so what do we do about punishment? And people have studied that part, but they forget about the frame, which says that punishment should be a really vanishingly small part of the overall social system. If we get education right, we get nutrition right, we get health care right, and so on. And he had in view a big book on the social welfare state, but it's either not published or it may not even be finished enough to be published. We have to await the results of that project in London. But I think that's really a very important lesson, because even philosophers today, when they think about punishment, they talk about the justification of punishment, as though what we're comparing are different schemes of punishment. But Bentham's point, which is absolutely right, is that we have to ask how punishment at all measures up to other strategies that, if we were wise, we would be using first before we get to that point. And of course, societies then and now have failed at that larger task. So, criminal justice, I think, is a very important intervention, and Bentham, in this case, is the primary one. He actually tried to get his system taken up by James Madison. He wrote to James Madison and said, here's a law code, and what do you think of that? And James Madison said, well, actually, the criminal law is made by each state separately, so you have to write to the governors of the state. So Bentham wrote to every governor of every existing state at the time and got total icy silence from everyone. So anyway, he did try. Second major intervention, the equality of women. Now, one very obvious way in which stability would be suddenly threatened would be if 1/2 of the population were enfranchised. And it's obvious that a Burkean would not want suddenly all these new people coming in and voting, but the utilitarians definitely did. Mill proposes sweeping changes in laws relating to women. First of all, the suffrage. He introduced the first bill in the British Parliament for the enfranchisement of women in 1869. He was a member of Parliament. But he also recommended other things, including laws against rape within marriage. That was a very prescient intervention, in the sense that laws against rape within marriage are still not perfect. Every state has some such thing, but it's not regarded as an offense that's equivalent to stranger rape. So we still are working on that one, but Mill, in the Subjection of Women in 1866, did already work, 1869 already worked on that. So he also recommended opening institutions of higher education to women and the other various professions. And most controversial of all, he recommended women's equal access to divorce. And that was all in the mid-50s and 60s. All of these were extremely counter-traditional, but they were defended on utilitarian grounds as improving the happiness, the average happiness of society. Sidgwick was a big intervention here, because he and the woman he married, I have to say that it was marriage that was never consummated because he was a closeted gay man, and we know from his wife's papers that the marriage was not consummated. But anyway, they were good political partners, and they founded together Newnham College in Cambridge, which was the second women's college, but in a way the most successful at Cambridge University. So, furthermore, Mill's book, The Subjection of Women, 1869, is one of the best accounts of the various dimensions of women's inferiority. And it even includes the idea that women are led by the hierarchy to tailor their own self-presentation and their preferences even maybe to submissiveness and trying to make a good impression on men. So he anticipates in many, many ways the radical feminists of the 1970s. And the book, as he points out, was crucially inspired by his wife, Harriet Taylor, who also wrote things that were a little bit more radical. So they were quite a set of partners. And Harriet Taylor was very in touch with American radical sex equal circles. So that was an interesting area. But even more surprising, in a way, was the intervention regarding same-sex acts. So basically, here's the situation. The death penalty was decreed for buggery, which is anal intercourse, by the Buggery Act of 1533, and the executed person's property would be confiscated by the government. So you can imagine all the corruptions that ensued as people denounced their family members so they could get their hands on their, well, anyway, so you see the point. They'd get rid of the property. And even if for lack of evidence, because it was often very hard to prove anal intercourse, the charge was reduced to attempted buggery. The punishment was very severe, including long periods in prison and time in the pillory. Various reforms only made the law more severe, removing the requirement of evidence of ejaculation, which was the only piece of evidence they would have. And buggery ceased to be a capital offense only in 1861, but the punishment was still very severe. But then, what I was alluding to earlier, in 1895, they decided that they had never criminalized oral sex. Well, that would be something we could do to imprison more people. So they, and by the way, it was always only for men. Sex between women was never illegal in Britain, and it had never had been. And so the whole decriminalization effort in 1967 was entirely about men. So the Labouchere Amendment in 1885 added a special kind of offense, which it was called the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which was basically oral sex. And that was what under which Oscar Wilde was convicted in 1895, because Oscar Wilde apparently either preferred oral sex or there was no evidence that he had engaged in anal sex. It was punished with 2 years at hard labor, which was very hard. I mean, Oscar Wilde's health, he was a relatively young man at that time, and his health was completely broken down, and that was a pretty common thing. And this went on happening, and actually in the 1950s there was a kind of witch hunt. Just while we were hunting communists in Britain, they were hunting gay men, and a lot of prominent people went to prison, and Alan Turing, the famous cryptographer and mathematician, was in fact convicted and had to take sort of hormonal castration is what they called it, and subsequently committed suicide. So all of these things happened up till a very recent time, and it was only, as I say, in 1967 that same-sex acts between men were decriminalized, and eventually, on the 50th anniversary of that, the Queen issued a blanket retrospective pardon for everyone who had ever been convicted under any of these laws, but quite late for most of them. Okay, so Bentham, here's Bentham, way back in the 18th century. He makes remarks in passing suggesting that he did favor radical reform in the laws of marriage and divorce, but he apparently didn't devote an extensive treatise to that topic. But he focused very extensively on the legal regulation of homosexual conduct, which he held to be altogether irrational and contrary to public welfare. There are 4 works that he published between 1785 and 1818, and none of them, by the way, were published in they weren't in our grip until 2013, when London edited them and released them. But especially, there was this long, remarkable book called Not Paul, But Jesus, part of which was published in his lifetime under a pseudonym, but the most controversial parts were not published at all until 2013. He produced a barrage of fascinating and very cogent arguments in favor of decriminalization. And what was so interesting was that his arguments turned out to be very similar to some of the arguments that Richard Posner used in the case Baskin versus Bogan, in throwing out the laws against same-sex marriage in Wisconsin and Indiana. And of course, he didn't know about Bentham, so it was like I said, it's not that you're becoming more like Bentham, but Bentham is becoming more like you, because these works came out in 2013. Well, so what are the arguments? Some of the arguments involve detailed exegesis of the Bible, and he does argue with great attention to the Greek and great sophistication that Jesus approved of same-sex conduct, and he then alleges, this is less carefully argued, I think, that Jesus himself even practiced same-sex conduct. But let's just focus on the core political arguments concerning harm to society. And remember, everything has to be tested to think whether it promotes net happiness. And so, first question, do same-sex acts harm society by causing a decrease in reproduction? Well, Bentham says, after all, homosexual individuals have certainly fathered children, and that's not so difficult to do. Reproduction doesn't take a very great deal of time, and you could just do that and have plenty of time left over for other pursuits, some of them sexual. He says where heterosexuals are concerned, we never assume that their whole life is taken up with reproduction, but somehow with gay men, we do make that silly assumption. So, no reason to think that people would be incapable of producing children, but moreover, he says Malthus has shown us that we have to worry about too many people, not too few people, and so we should just think, well, this might be actually quite good for keeping down the population. A more serious worry, he takes it actually much more seriously, would be that if there are a lot of male-male couples, women might lack for sex and companionship. Now, he does know about female homosexuality, but he thinks, and probably quite plausibly, that the number is considerably smaller than the number of gay men. So his response is very, very interesting. He says, actually, what does women the greatest harm is their legal subordination, what he calls the afflictiveness of the yoke to which they are subjected. What is this yoke? Well, marriage is a big part of it. And it's certainly not caused by homosexuality. It's very often caused by heterosexuality, what he calls the magnitude of the value set upon their charms by their barbarian masters. It's sort of like Catherine McKinnon in many respects, thinking that sexual desire is the linchpin of female subordination. So he says, actually, if you look around the world, women do better in countries with a larger number of open homosexuals. Now, his data, he doesn't tell us where he gets these figures. He thinks Italy has a larger number of open homosexuals, and England has the smaller number, and France is right in the middle. Hard to say, because actually France had been the first to decriminalize same-sex acts. Napoleon caused the decriminalization early in the 19th century. So I don't know where he gets these figures. But more generally, Bentham lays siege to the entire traditional Victorian ideology of higher pleasures and lower pleasures. What were typically the typical Victorian way of representing things was that sexual pleasure within marriage was higher because it was connected with reproduction, it was sanctioned by the church, and other kinds of sexual pleasure were lower, and the people who engaged in them were tainted and could not be full members of society. So there's a lot to be said about the treatment of women who have sex outside marriage, particularly sex workers and so on. That's a separate topic, but in any case, certainly the pleasures of same-sex acts are taken to be lower pleasures. A very common way of thinking today, I think. But Bentham says, look, pleasure is pleasure. What orifice of the body you use is totally irrelevant to the pleasure that you experience, and it's pleasure that we should be thinking of. He said it would be quite irrational if you had a law that said you could scratch your nose when it itches with this finger and not with this finger. And he thinks laws against same-sex acts are just like that. Okay, so he repeatedly says the reason we've got such laws is just a screen for a kind of hypocritical self-privileging and ultimate sadism, since the dominant group defines its own pleasures as high, and then it uses that distinction as a way of inflicting pain on the powerless people. Mill, interestingly, to my knowledge, says not one thing about same-sex acts. So in a way, although he was radical about women, and he did do the radical thing of having an open relationship with a married woman for many years while she was married to somebody else, even though they probably never had sex, so he wasn't that radical. But in any case, he's probably the least radical in a way of the three. Okay, now I want to turn to animals. And this is, as I say, I'm writing a book now on animal rights. And of course, even in the present day, the utilitarian Peter Singer has been one of the great defenders of animal rights. But it's very fascinating to see how they began. So Bentham was a lifelong companion of animals. People who wrote about him told stories about how the animals in his village he would always befriend, and he would take a walk with a pig, and even the rats and mice in his study he would play with and just encourage them to run on his lap and so on. So he was a lifelong friend of animals. Mill, we don't know about his personal relations with animals, but he did leave the entirety of his estate to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So the two, now Sidgwick says some things about animals, but only very briefly. Mill explicitly and forcefully defends Bentham on this point in an important essay which most people neglect, but it's published, it's in the Penguin Anthology of Utilitarianism, called Whewell and Moral Philosophy. So it's so that's pronounced Whewell, and Whewell was a conservative Christian cleric who didn't like Bentham and who influentially attacked Bentham's views of animals. So we get a lot out of that essay. So let me talk first of all about Bentham. Bentham, in the introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, is talking, of course, about humans, but he can't resist the opportunity to make a statement about animal rights. So there's this long footnote, and I will read you the footnote, and it's quite remarkable because it also shows that he is thinking about the insights you can derive from Hinduism and Islam. Under the Gentoo, by which he means Hindu, under the Gentoo and Mohammedan religion, the interests of the rest of the animal kingdom, notice that he says the rest of the animal kingdom, not the animal kingdom, seem to have met with some attention. Why have they not universally, with as much as those of human creatures, allowance made for the difference in point of sensibility? Because the laws that are have been the work of mutual fear, a sentiment which the less rational animals have not had the same means as man has of turning to account. In other words, you make laws to defend yourself against something you fear, and that's what we've done, and subordinated animals, but animals haven't had the chance to do the same thing. Why ought they not? In other words, not to have the same opportunity to make laws? No reason can be given. The day may come when the rest of the animal creation may acquire those rights which never could have been withholden from them but by the hand of tyranny. It may come one day to be recognized that the number of legs, the velocity of the skin, that means the hairiness of the skin, or the termination of the os sacrum, that is the shape of the end of the spine, whether it has a tail or not, are reasons insufficient for abandoning a sensitive being to the caprice of a tormentor. What else is it that should trace the insuperable line? Is it the faculty of reason, or perhaps the faculty of discourse? But a full-grown horse or dog is beyond comparison a more rational as well as a more conversable animal than an infant of a day, a week, or even a month old. But suppose the case were otherwise, what would it avail? The question is not can they reason, nor can they speak, but can they suffer? So this is a wonderful footnote, we don't know a whole lot more about specific laws that he favored, but we do know something. There's a dissertation that I supervised in our philosophy department a while back by a man named Jadron Lee, which you can look up in the library. And he did go to the archive in London. He found that Bentham wrote about making hunting for sport and fishing for sport illegal. And he had a lot to say about whether it was ever legitimate to kill animals. He actually thought that the harm of death was a harm just in case you had a painful anticipation of death and or had a life that was not flourishing in the first place. So he did think, and this is, we certainly must debate today, that if an animal has a flourishing life up to the point of death and is killed in a genuinely painless manner, then for most animals, and he did think most animals can't have this kind of fear and anticipation of death, then it would be permitted to kill animals. But anyway, those things are debatable, but that he even engaged in the argument is quite remarkable. Now then, Mill comes back to this, because Whewell is making fun of Bentham, and he says, well, the reductio ad absurdum of all of Bentham's work is this footnote concerning the rights of animals. It would require us to actually consider the pleasures and pains of animals and weigh them in the balance along with human pleasures. And he says, well, we should judge any being's pleasures by their likeness to ourselves. So here Mill digs in, and he says, oh, well, on that principle, then I guess slavery is a just institution. Now, by this time, by the way, most Britons thought the institution of slavery was appalling and indefensible, and so the slave trade had long been eradicated so far as Britain was concerned. But the institution itself, most people in Britain, unlike the US, thought was indefensible. So he's trying to get Whewell by showing that his argument would require us to vindicate the slave owners, because they would say, oh, well, the pleasures of white people are different from the pleasures of black people, and we should judge any being's pleasures by likeness to ourselves. And so he turns the tables and shows that would saddle Whewell with a completely indefensible position. And so then he continues to a conclusion that's, I think, too vague, but it's still pretty interesting. We are perfectly willing to stake the whole question on this one issue. Granted that any practice causes more pain to animals than it gives pleasure to man, is that practice moral or immoral? And if exactly in proportion as human beings raise their heads out of the slough of selfishness, they do not with one voice answer immoral, that the morality of the principle of utility be forever condemned. Now, where does that take us? I think it clearly takes us to the banning of the factory farming industry, which they were fortunate enough not to even know. But, it's hard to know exactly how we would deploy it today as an overall principle. But in any case, you see where they were going, and that they were going for a society in which the pleasures of animals counted fully in the social calculus. And Sidgwick says this too. So, taking stock, I think utilitarian legal rationalism can seem like a kind of refreshing opening of the windows, like a ray of light illuminating the smug and frequently quite repressive darkness of the Victorian era. And yet, the view still has many difficulties. So anyone who sympathizes with the program has to grapple with those difficulties. The first is the implausibility of the metric of pleasure. Pleasure, of course, the first question is, what is pleasure? And the Greeks thought pleasure wasn't a feeling at all. It was more like a certain way of being active. So you have to engage in that philosophical debate. And Bentham never bothered. He just assumed he knew what pleasure was. It was a kind of measurable feeling that varies only in intensity and duration and is the same across all subjects. And probably that's not defensible in the end. So here's where Mill famously says Bentham failed in deriving light from other minds. He just never read the history of philosophy, wasn't aware that there had been these sophisticated debates about what pleasure is. So the first question is what is pleasure? But even if we accept Bentham's view of pleasure as a feeling, we still have to ask, is that actually a relevant goal for society? Because you might get measurability by narrowing your sights in that way, but you might get it at the price of irrelevance. And what a good example of this is in the ancient Greek comedy by Aristophanes called The Frogs. They're trying to choose between two playwrights, Aeschylus and Euripides, who are very, very different qualitatively. And so the judge, the god Dionysus is the judge, he's having a very hard time making the choice. And then he comes up with the bright idea. Let's use weight as the criterion of measure, the weight of the items mentioned in an average line of poetry of Aeschylus or Euripides. So then they get out the balance scale, and Aeschylus says chariot upon chariot, corpse upon corpse. So those items are very heavy items, so the scale goes down. Euripides says, oh, the airiness of light-winged thought, so the scale goes not so far down, and Aeschylus wins. Now, you see, by going to weight, he gets a clear decision process, but it's at the cost of something that's quite irrelevant to the judgment between two very different poets. And I think there's something like that that happens with Bentham. He's so bent on having an objective metric that's single and simple that he doesn't really ask enough about what people are really pursuing and what a good society really will pursue. And Mill tries to do that. So Mill criticizes him a lot and says, look, you've got a lot of different things that people actually pursue. They pursue not just states, but activities of many different kinds. And furthermore, these activities differ in quality, not just in quantity. So he's very Aristotelian, and he re-imports a kind of Aristotelian element into utilitarianism. So that is sort of what I'm inclined to do. And I guess I would defend that Aristotelian element by saying that even though we see that societies very, very often, if not typically, go wrong, when at the concrete level, when they're making judgments about whether we should privilege this person's happiness or this person's happiness, sometimes if you look at what people tend to value at a higher level of generality, they value completeness of life, activities of many different kinds, and so the higher level of generality is a bit more reliable than the lower level of generality. So we might, at least with great caution, look to the past for something, and thereby making a kind of a mixture of the best of Aristotelianism with the best of utilitarianism. But of course, the problem is we think, if we start looking to the past, aren't we back in the common law soup again? First of all, the sheer messiness and indeterminacy of getting all the activities that are the right ones out there. Second, whether we haven't in some way, unknown to ourselves, baked elitism into the list. So, to fast forward to my own view, the capabilities approach, the way I've tried to do that is to say, well, the first problem can be solved if we keep checking all the time and listen to many voices of many different people, and we keep encountering criticisms of our own position and testing again. But more importantly, a second thing is that if you make the items on the list opportunities for choice rather than the activities themselves, then you allow a lot of freedom and flexibility. And so if somebody doesn't like one activity, if that doesn't express their sense of what makes their life meaningful, well, they just won't use that one. So the capabilities approach is a kind of political welfarism with multiple parts, very much in the spirit of Mill. But all of them, and I mean this is again sort of in the spirit of Mill, I think, are freedoms or opportunities for choice rather than being things that you're required to do. So the way we would assess the societies to ask what spaces for choice, what freedoms in some crucial areas it has opened up for its citizens. So I think, this is what I keep trying to think about and trying to do. But I still think that in this debate between the common law part and the utilitarian part, Bentham and Mill have the last word, because even when we're operating at a high level of generality, we always need to be highly critical, highly selective, and on our guard against privilege of all sorts, especially including the privilege of intellectual elites. The past may be a little more reliable at a higher level of generality than at a lower, but it certainly is not infallible. So while we try to derive light from other minds, I think the last word of the utilitarians is that we ought to discard mere authority and think for ourselves. So thanks. Okay, so I deliberately left a lot of time for questions, and this is there's a lot of stuff you could ask about in many different areas. So yes, and say who you are so that everyone else will know who's talking.
Alex Schulman of So I know Bentham, given relative to the day, very radically pro-democracy. Mill maybe not so much, but I just wanted to ask you more generally about the relationship between utilitarianism and political democracy. Because I mean, what if it's the case that majorities make, on some dimension, systematically anti-utilitarian decisions, right? What if they tend to punish sexual deviance, from their perspective, or animals, or criminalize drug use, or things like this that seem systematically anti-utilitarian? I mean, it seems like up to a point, utilitarianism and democracy are very well matched. One person, one vote, that sort of thing. Except then there comes to a point where you almost want to have a sort of Posnerian, utilitarian technocracy to make sure majorities don't do stupid things. So what exactly do you see in the relationship?
Well, I think Bentham, it sounds like he was in favor of democracy, but not so much when it comes to the crunch, as your question rightly suggests, because he thought most people were pretty stupid and they didn't see the merits of his proposals. So that's why he had this complete legislative code, and he went around peddling it, and he wanted them to accept it as one complete meal. And then, of course, they could enact it, but they had to accept the one that he wrote. So he was not very good at thinking like a Democrat when it was his own work that was in question. It's very funny that in the Not Paul But Jesus, where he's in the part that he published under a pseudonym, Gamaliel Smith, he refers to the writings of Bentham, but he refers always favorably. And he certainly was very sure that he had the right answer. Mill is a more truly humble and critical spirit who really wants to learn from others. But as you say, he was worried about people having the suffrage who hadn't had any education. He did propose a property restriction. I think that's one of his least happy moments. The other thing we could think about ultimately is, what did they think about colonial domination? Adam Smith, proto-utilitarian, had already been an extremely strong opponent of colonial domination on total utilitarian grounds, that it caused great pain and subordination for large numbers of people, while not really, in the end, doing anything very much for the subordinating group. But Mill, unfortunately, since he, being an atheist, he could not hold a university position, and Bentham didn't need one because he was independently wealthy, but Mill did need to earn an income. He worked for the British East India Company and therefore got kind of co-opted into this colonial world. And the things he writes about India are the worst things, I think, that he ever wrote about it's okay to impose laws on this primitive people. And here we see the worst of intellectual elitism. So we've got to remember that we don't want to do that. Now, I guess my feeling is that the best mean would be, number one, an independent judiciary that apparently would be at least able and educated in utilitarian thinking. And I think this is indeed what the law of economics movement has tried to do, is to say, sure, you've got to look to precedent and stare decisis we're not going to throw out, but you ought to also be thinking of social welfare. And as early as Holmes and Cardozo, there had been a kind of mixture of those two elements. So the judiciary is one part, but another part would be the administrative state. I think that the utilitarians would have been very happy that in certain areas, like environment and the treatment of animals, we would have people who actually knew science making the decisions. Now, what happened to my water? Wait a minute. Yeah, so it's not perfect, and I think we never have the right, there's no single solution here, because we have to balance the value of one person, one vote against the value of true and precise accounting. And very hard to do that, I think. That's why, okay, just one more thing. They were operating in Britain, which has never had a written constitution. I do think that one part of a good solution, and certainly my own approach favors this, is to have a written constitution with some basic entitlements that cannot be removed by majority vote, but only by a laborious process such as we have. Now, even then, they need to be interpreted, and lots of slippage possible there, but I actually think if animals really had rights in that sense, like a constitutional right that you couldn't remove except by this super majoritarian process that we have, that would be so much better than depending on the vicissitudes of the meat industry and all of the other interest groups that swirl around this issue. Yeah.
Austin Yamamoto 10. A really stupid sounding question, but did Bentham have a definition of what an animal is? And do you have a definition of what an animal is?
To my knowledge, he didn't. It was taken pretty for granted that animals included, pretty much the way Aristotle classified them way back in the 4th century, namely that all the vertebrates and many, many invertebrates, including the ones that Aristotle called the stationary animals. That is, there's some animals that appear to have sense perception but do not move from place to place, like sponges and anemones and so on. So Bentham would have been thinking about all those. Now, what did he think about the rights of anemones and even of cephalopods and starfish and so on? He didn't comment on any marine life. He probably didn't know much about marine life. He lived in a village all his life. But in any case, that's what we typically mean. Now, what do I include? There are two questions. Should plants also have rights on the grounds that their behavior responds to the environment? And second, where do we draw the line? Okay, I think the right place to draw the line is probably where Aristotle drew it, where there's some evidence of not just a kind of adaptability, like plants move toward the sun and away from the shade, but some kind of subjective experience of a kind. Very hard to have evidence for that, and yet it looks like certainly most of the ones I've mentioned, maybe even some insects, have that. But the crucial question for me in thinking about what matters is pain. And so I do think the utilitarians were right to make that a crucial focus, because what they would say, and what I also would say is, well, we can discuss separately whether it's bad or good to pluck up an oak tree, but that's not the same kind of thing as causing, as he says, torment to a being who feels pain. And to me, pain is a very crucial dividing line. Not all the people who write about animals agree. So the philosopher Christine Korsgaard she has a footnote. So she's kind of writing about animals, but then she has a footnote, Benthamian footnote about plants. And she does think that because plants pursue a kind of teleological process where they preserve their existence and they reproduce, that would be enough. But anyway, that's all stuff we have to debate as this movement goes forward. Yeah, in the back.
Elijah Giuliano. So, suppose that the utilitarians, or you actually, I'm interested in both of your views, confront somebody who says, yeah, I see that animals suffer, but I just don't care. And what's in it for me? Do they have arguments intended to show that people who say don't care about animal rights will be better off if they recognize them as
Well, the first thing, of course, is that with they would say it's the same sort of thing as human pleasure and pain, and you could say till you're blue in the face, I don't care about the pain of this child I'm torturing, but that, where the law is concerned, that should have no ice at all. So the similarity of experience, pain being very prominent, but then if you're a more Millian sort of animal person, as I am, you would think about there's an organized form of life where certain ends are being pursued, including nutrition, reproduction, perception, and so on. So you list all this similarity in a kind of teleological organization, and then say, by what privilege do you elevate yourself above that? Aren't they really very similar? And so this is, Christine Korsgaard thinks that even a Kantian who sees the rationality and the possibility of moral choice are the central things, ought to concede that we provide for our sentience, for our development, for our continued life. And so if we do that, and if indeed, as Kant thinks, we have obligations to provide for our continued life, then we have obligations to provide for the continued life, even of creatures who don't have that kind of moral rationality. So, but I'm not a Kantian, and I have no reason to think that moral rationality is so special. So it's easier for me. But since you're asking how to convince an opponent, I think Korsgaard's essay, it's a set of Tanner lectures, is a really good job, because she's taking a view that's, although much more philosophically rich than the standard Judeo-Christian view, it's kind of similar in structure in that it carves out a special place for the human in virtue of capacities for morality. And then she says, well, nonetheless, you don't think that you have duties only to your morality and your rationality. You actually think that you need to feed yourself, provide for other people to be fed, and so on. And insofar as you say that, then you're already accepting the value of those activities, and then other creatures who share that, you ought to protect by the same token. So I think that would be one very good way of bringing that group of people on board. Of course, there are always people who are going to be obtuse about any argument, but as I say, I think the question has force only when we can identify a group of people who are not just digging in their heels, but who really have an interesting countervailing argument. I would also, so back to my view, I would also say, hey, what is this ladder of nature with the humans at the top? If we think of different abilities in different animal lives, well, we might be at the top in some. But then, if we even turn to things like empathy and the capacity for a variety of emotions, that's no longer so clear. Frans de Waal, who was here last week, I think, has done wonderful work showing the capacities for emotion in many different animal species. But then what about spatial perception? We're not very good at that. And a lot of birds are much better. And what about smell? We're not at all good at that, and most animals are a lot better. So by what right do we rank abilities in this hypocritical, self-insulating way, privileging just the ones that we happen to be very good at? So this is how I would argue. But if somebody is coming from a religious or moral view in which moral rationality has a special place, then I think we could turn for that person to Korsgaard's argument. You were first, I think.
Thank you. My name is Trevor Kerr. I'm 1L. I have a pair of questions. The first is very short, and it leads into the second. As I understand it, your view of utilitarianism is based on minimizing pain, right?
Well, not exactly. That Bentham's view is producing the greatest net balance of pleasure over pain. But since I've gone over to a Millian view, and what you're trying to maximize is opportunities for valuable activities. First of all, there's got to be more than one thing going on, and pain is not the only thing. But there are many different incommensurable parts that differ in quality. My capabilities approach has spelled them out. Life, bodily integrity, bodily health, and a bunch of other things. So no, I mean, once you depart from the singleness and you go over to this more pluralistic view, then you've got a lot more complicated task.
Okay. With that elucidation, if there's like a hierarchy of sorts in valuable activities, presumably there would be a trade-off of some sort. So if let's say that plants do have rights for sake of argument, corn wants to grow and reproduce itself, right? And if you take a field of 1 million units of corn, maybe that equals the satisfaction of 1 human's meal. So what do you do when you reach a point
Right.
where they conflict?
Okay, so there's a general point, which is that if you have plural ends, there can always be conflict. So even just sticking to the human, this is where I think the idea of constitutional rights becomes very useful. So suppose we have, as in my view, 10 things that we want to protect. Then we don't want to maximize them all. That would be probably an incoherent exercise because they do conflict. But we want to achieve a threshold for each of them. And that's really the way we do think about constitutional rights. We don't think about maximizing the freedom of speech and maximizing the freedom of religion. We think about what an acceptable threshold of protection is for each of these different things. And so then, if they do conflict, the first question is it a conflict that forces some people below the threshold? If it is, then we got a problem. And then I think we need to recognize that sometimes we're in a tragic situation where to protect some people, we might have to disadvantage others, or to protect them in one area, we might have to disadvantage them in others. But then, that's a sign that things are bad. And once we see that things are bad and that we're in this tragic situation where we can't make good on our promises, so to speak, then we have to design things in future so that we don't get put in that situation again. This is Hegel's idea of tragedy, is when you see the clash of right with right, then your first thought should be, all right, how did we get into this mess? Let's not get into it next time. So in war, let's say we might think we have to kill some innocent civilians in order to save everyone from being nuked. Okay, suppose we think that with good reason. Still, we shouldn't be thinking just of that. We should be thinking, that is really, really bad. We have done wrong. We have not made good on our promises, and we better set about getting to a position where we never have to do that again. So I think basically that's my approach. So a lot of the human-animal conflicts are conflicts that can be removed over time by intelligent devices. So for example, meat eating, I think it's already on the cards, and Duvall was saying this himself, that in the end we can get around this whole problem by synthetic meat that doesn't require a creature to be the source of it and doesn't require the torment and the pain of a creature. A lot of us already eat synthetic meat, but we can be made better and more like the meat that people like. So that's one thing we can do. Research that's done by computer simulation, we're already doing a lot of that, and surgery by lasers can be exploratory in a way that gives us valuable experimental information that otherwise would have to be done by surgery of animals. So moving to that world in which we don't have to use animals as tools for these purposes, while recognizing that there's something tragic and harmful that we're doing. Duvall notes that we don't use chimps for that kind of pain-inflicting research anymore, and that's a very recent thing. But, of course, that doesn't satisfy me because we still use a lot of other animals. So moving toward a world in which we can pursue what we want to pursue, that is getting medical research done without inflicting harm on creatures. I think we have time for one last question. There hasn't been a question from a woman yet, I note, and this is something I would like to avoid. So is there any woman who has a question? Well, if not, I will take the remaining male question. Yes. Yeah.
I'm Parker Whitfield. I'm a philosophy student. I was wondering if you think the fact that so many utilitarians made these seemingly correct moral judgments against the common wisdom of the time in a way that, say, Aristotle and Kant didn't, is evidence that utilitarianism is correct?
Well, it's a good question, and of course, it's hindsight takes you only so far, because actually, for a long time, people thought, oh, Victorian Christianity is correct and Aristotle is incorrect. And so, you know, you study the history of philosophy and you realize that people have been wrong about what progress is. I guess what I think it shows us is that being an outsider can give you very good epistemic value. Because these were people who, as I say, could not teach in a university. And once you do teach in a university, there's pressure to conform and not to say anything too wild. And I mean, look, I have encountered that a lot because I work also on the emotions, and I remember people making fun of writing about the emotions as though that was some frilly topic that only women would go in for. So, you know, if you're an outsider, that can often lead to pressure to conform. On the one hand, women have often, I think, felt all the more need to toe the line and do what everyone else was doing. And that happened for about 20 years, sort of before me. But I was just at the point where I guess I reaped the advantages of an outsider placement, but had at least some people who would listen to what I was saying. And fortunately for me, there were powerful men who had blazed the trail, like Bernard Williams and Richard Valheim and Stanley Cavell. So anyway, being an outsider can be valuable. And I think we've got protections that no one had in those days. There was no academic freedom. There was no tenure. But the downside of those protections can be complacency and conventionality. And we always have to be on our guard against that. Okay, so thank you very much. We have to get out and make room for the class. But thanks a lot. And please come and talk.